Since 2003, this is the Sports Source, East Tennessee's #1 sports talk show.
Presented by Junk Be Gone, Phoenix Conversions.
With your host, John Pennington. The Sports Source starts now.
Good Sunday morning. Welcome into the Sports Source. Happy to have you with us today. The Volunteers win 30-7. Might not have been the most beautiful game in the world, but you know what? Compared to Georgia State, they did what they're supposed to do. You get an inferior foe, you take care of business, and they did that last night. We will talk all about the good. We'll talk about the not so good that needs to be improved on. We'll also talk a little basketball today. Isaiah Victor, VFL, with us. Nobody better to talk about the Uros Plavsic decision and having to sit for a year than Isaiah Victor. So we'll cover all of that today's show. Let's just get right into it. First segment of today's show brought to you by Phoenix Conversions. Whether you are just looking to soup up and deck out your own personal vehicle or outfit an entire fleet of trucks or vans for your company, the first people to call are Phoenix Conversions. Since way back in 1987, they've been doing this. You'll be amazed at the things they do. Check out phoenixconversions.com to see more. Run by and have a chat with them, and I guarantee you they can take good care of you. Tell them we sent you. Phoenix Conversions. All right, want to welcome in today's first round of panelists. We got 10 people on the show today. Right here, number one, Bob
Thank
Hott.
you.
Will Overstreet, Jimmy Himes.
Don't call me number two.
Number three, and David Oven down there. Let's talk about the game from the first play, a Bryce Thompson interception, to the last play. UAB really never had, that game was never in doubt, which, again, going into that game last week, and there was nothing wrong with saying this, last week we all said, hey, if you can lose to Georgia State, you better take it seriously. I think we saw last night how far this team has come since Georgia State, especially on defense. Defense, good. Offense, that's another question. And I want to ask you guys, and also I want to say this. Back when they started 0-2, we asked, what's your prediction? And a lot of us saw maybe 4 wins. They're already at 4 wins. Kudos to that. I didn't think it would come as quickly as it did to win 4 of their next 7 games after opening 0-2. Kudos for that. All right, so offense didn't look great last night. They had 9 plays of 19 or more yards last week versus South Carolina. They had 4 yesterday against UAB. Let me show you some numbers here in terms of this offense overall and some of the things that might have been issues. Their run game, you can see 3 yards a rush. They had a good game against BYU, good game against Mississippi State. Everywhere else, it's been about 3 to 3.5 yards a carry, which is very average. Passing yards per game, incredibly inconsistent. And you got 15 giveaways here in these two areas. So the first question is the offense that we saw yesterday good enough to win 2 of the next 3 games?
I don't think it is, John. I think they got to get better. Look, the defense they carried the mail, but one of Tennessee's field goal drives was for 1 yard. Another one was for -5 yards. And that was based off of turnovers that they got. I charted them until the last drive because it didn't really matter. But Tennessee had 14 runs of 1 or fewer yards. And I thought that they missed some open receivers. I didn't think they were very efficient in the pass game. I think the offense has to be better if they want to win 2 more games.
Yeah, the offensive line last night looked a lot like the unit that we saw last year, and that group, is still growing up. They've got better personnel, but if they play like that, I think it does come down to the offensive line. The quarterbacks weren't great. The receivers, when the quarterbacks aren't great, that's going to translate to the receivers. But last night, I think you could put on the offensive line. If you can't run the ball consistently, it makes it tough to set up play action, get the ball down the field. Quarterbacks were hassled. I mean, it comes down to the line, and they look like they took a step back last night. So they've got to play better over these last 3 games.
Let me throw this caveat in there before you guys go. All right, UAB came into the game. We know where they play. We know what their conference is. But they came in with a top 10 defense in 4 different categories: run defense, pass defense, total defense, scoring defense. How seriously do you take that when you look at Tennessee's struggles on offense?
I think you got to take it a little bit seriously. I mean, they are a Division I football team. And I think they probably have some players on their defense that could play in the SEC. They wouldn't be stars, but I think you look over there and you see some guys that could probably play in the SEC. I'm going to go in a different direction than Jimmy and David, though. I'm going to say Tennessee's offense can win because of the opponents. if you took this team and you said, okay, you got to go back through the Florida, Georgia, Alabama grind again, no, they couldn't win with this offense. But if you look what the other teams are doing offensively, they're not putting up points by the bushel either. So it goes back to your key. If Tennessee doesn't turn it over, yes, this offense can win. However, if it gets into a shootout, this doesn't look like a shootout kind of offense.
Okay.
Well, that also depends if your defense gets you the ball within scoring position. I mean, I think this offense, if you continue to play this way, you're counting on your defense doing some special things and getting you very close to scoring if this offense is going to be able to win the next 2 out of 3 games. But you're right. The biggest problem right now is your offensive line is letting up a lot more kill shots on your quarterback. With a bunch of quarterbacks that you haven't seen be able to put together strings of health for several weeks in a row. So I think that's your biggest concern right now is, do you get into a Kentucky game, you put one guy in, he gets knocked out, you put the next guy in and he gets knocked out. That's where you're really concerned with this team, and can they make it through?
I think David touched on this. If you ask me, I think most people out there, well, it's the pass game they're more concerned about. I'm more concerned with the run game. If you could line up and just run it down these teams' throats, like UAB, I mean, granted, you're right, could totally discount a team that's ranked in the top 10 in defense. At the same time, if you want to say, well, Tennessee's back, then Tennessee would run it down UAB's throat, okay? Right. And that would take pressure. If you could run it down these teams' throats, you're not having to put it into Garantano's hand, into Brian Maurer's hand, into JT Shrout's hand. Just run it. For me, the bigger concern here is the run offense with this offensive line. David, it sounded like you kind of agree with that. Or do you?
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I asked Jerry Pruitt about their improvement on Wednesday, and he brought up some pretty interesting points. I mean, you look at last week, they scored twice on special teams. So people want to look at 41 points. Like, well, okay, that's not bad, but like, you had basically 27. And then you look at last week. What if Tennessee doesn't start all those possessions in UAB territory, where you have scoring drives of -5 yards and 1 yard? Well, that's a very, very different game if you don't win the turnover battle quite as resoundingly as you did. Tennessee is a better team. Are they a completely different team? It's tough to say because, those things do, sort of change the score. But you still made those plays. You still did score twice on special teams. You did get those turnovers, and those weren't happening earlier in the season. So, I think, is this team maybe somewhat overvalued? Probably, but they're making plays that they didn't make earlier in the season, and there's value in them.
Hard to count on 2 special team scores per game, though.
Or 3 interceptions.
They got 20 points off of turnovers in UAB.
Yeah.
And they only really had 2 nice drives that led to 10 points, which is why I differ from Bob on that. 10 points to me, unless you're getting a bunch of turnovers, is not good enough.
The other problem, we mentioned it last week, we did some trends that, we ranked them, which are the bigger concerns. And one of the big ones we ranked was the red zone offense. They came in, there were only 3 teams in America worse in the red zone than Tennessee. Last night, they got 3 touchdowns in 5 chances. So that improved their overall mark for the year from 40% to 43% in terms of touchdown conversion in the red zone. That's just not good enough. That's got to improve. And now let me show you a stat here before we go back to this. Offensive line. We're all saying, I think there's a big perception that this offensive line is much better than last year. Here's a comparison. Your yards per rush on the season, that includes the Chattanooga game and the FCS game last year, the same. Rush yards per game, you're 2 yards per game better. Sacks allowed, you're right at the same. You're right at the same number. Where you've improved is you're not giving up as many tackles for loss. 1.5. Let's say that's a drive and a half per game that you're no longer punting because you fell behind the sticks. So that is a difference. But for the most part, this offensive line, they're getting better on every part of the team. I don't know that I'm willing to go there. Now, maybe that's just numbers. Man could drown in a 3-inch puck. But I'd give it a little bit of credence. I don't know that this. Defensive line, major improvement. Offensive line, I don't know.
I think those numbers are surprising to me.
Well,
I thought they were better than that.
Here's the thing. You've also started 2 freshman tackles a lot of this year. And so saying that this group, to start 2 freshman offensive tackles in the SEC and to say you're going to be the same, I think is actually a good thing in this case, because I think you can look at that and say, who would have thought you'd been able to start 2 freshmen and you wouldn't have gone backwards? So for me, I take it with that being the caveat in this case.
You're also better against Alabama Of course, Alabama's defense, you could argue, is not as good, but but you were better against Alabama clearly on your offensive line.
I think the only two things that I would point out to maybe push back on that is, one, I think the explosive plays in the passing game have come up since you made the switch to Maurer. He's allowed you to do that. Stroud had some nice plays. Garantano had some nice plays the previous week. And then also, I think when you look at the revolving door, the carousel at quarterback, that's hard for anyone to deal with. Ever since they basically made that switch to Maurer, you've had Maurer be injured. Garantano comes in. He plays last night with a giant cast on his hand. So it's not been an ideal situation at quarterback. Whereas last year, Garantano was beat up a little bit, but the play there was better. The play there was better. So it's tough to exactly point out or how good this offensive line is or isn't. The personnel is better. The results, you're right, have not been significantly better.
Here's how I push back against you guys. We got to go to break. Coming up next, we'll talk about the defense versus UAB. Which position group has performed the best, has improved the most since last year? We'll show you some impressive stats there. Also, I had some people yesterday asking me, why can't they bring the beer barrel back? Let's discuss that. That's coming up next on The Sports Source.
Hey, when you're away from home, catch us on Facebook Live, our YouTube channel, or on sportsource.tv.
Let's do it.
This is The Sports Source.